All right, great. Cloud, yay. All right, hello everybody and welcome to the fourth Game Excite lecture. I am extremely excited to introduce our guest today, who is Paolo Ruffino, really one of the international leaders in indie game studies. Paolo edited a book, which I have a chapter in, and many other key scholars have chapters in, which was, what was the year, 2013? Was
Well,
that
the
when that
edited
came out?
collection came out, oh no, actually much later. It was 2021.
2021. Yeah, so, but anyway, as somebody who's been tracking and studying the indie game scene for many, many years and is here to talk to us about kind of his current assessment after independence, which I think is funny, because I feel like we're both after and during, since publishers seem to be becoming increasingly irrelevant. So please help me to give a warm welcome to Paolo Ruffino.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Celia. So I'm going to share my screen. Oh, okay. Sorry. OS disable participant screen sharing.
Yeah,
So I
Celia,
need.
you need to authorize the sharing.
Got it.
Oh,
16.
here we are. Yeah, you got it. Okay, great. All right. So now you should see my slides full screen and
Yes.
my face too. Is that right? All good? Should
Yes,
I start?
perfect.
Okay, great. All right. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Sira. Thank you for inviting me to this series and for introducing me so nicely as a leader in indie game studies. I think that the thing is that I started, quite a long time ago, studying and working in this area. I actually prepare a very brief slide just highlighting some of these outputs that sort of I've been working with and on over the last, what is now maybe 15 years. I think the 2013 edited collection that you were probably had in mind was that issue of Loading, the Journal of the Canadian Game Studies Association, which was edited by Bart Simon at the time, where I had one of the, I was still doing my PhD, one of my earliest articles on video game culture, video independent game production and the narratives of empower and democratization that were associated with it at the time. And then I kept working in this field, mostly by focusing on the United Kingdom and London, where I've been based, where I've been conducting most of my research. In 2021, there has been this edited collection for Routledge, independent video games, cultures, networks, techniques, and politics. It's really gave me the opportunity to work with some, great authors that I've always been, citing and referring to throughout the years, who have been working in the analysis of, independent game production. And throughout the time, I've been carrying my research in game production, and I've always been, bringing with me some of the initial questions and interrogations that I brought with initially in relation to independent game making. I've been looking, for instance, at the emergence of labor unions in the UK video game industry, with the independent workers of Great Britain Game Workers branch, which resulted out from the Game Workers Unite movement. And I've been working with Jamie Woodcock, my friend and colleague, on an article, and then another one which kind of look at the emergence of collective organization in the game industry. But I was always kind of looking at it from the perspective of someone who's been quite curious about how game making at some point in time came to be to appropriate some of the dynamics of creative labor, which have been became visible earlier on in other creative sectors, and I will say something about this later today. So in this talk, really, I like to try to sort of make a point, let's say, what is the legacy of independent game development. And obviously, by saying legacy or by phrasing this as an after independence, I'm already kind of creating a narrative of before and after, which is of course absolutely instrumental here, because it's impossible to really say that there has been a before and after. But I'd like to argue that there has been a moment in time in the early 2010 when this idea of making video games independently became extremely popular and very well known and very, and let's say, received by the mainstream public, mainstream audience, way beyond game culture. And the question that was presented at the time, essentially, was who makes video games? And I think that ultimately this is the legacy, the thing that remains. It is a very open question, which has always been, presented surrounding the studies of video game production. But around 2010, this question received a very simple answer. It was presented as a radical answer, a new context and scenario for game production. And obviously, as all simple answers, it was, if not wrong, at least incomplete. So around the early 2010, these emerged, this image, essentially. The idea that video games can be made by a single individual or by a very small group, and by using the new technologies that were available at the time, the possibilities offered by digital distribution, one person or maybe a team of two could create a game that will reach international success. So what you see here is actually an image of Tommy Refenes, one of the two designers of the game Super Meat Boy, which at the time was one of the most celebrated indie games that reached international success and popularity. So how is this figure and this image, let's say, become popular? Well, because in 2012, the movie the documentary Indie Game, the movie, was released, and it reached a very broad audience. It reached an audience that was way beyond those interested in video games per se. Indie Game, the movie, was presented at the Sundance Film Festival, and it followed the story of three indie games that were being produced at the time. The game Braid by Jonathan Blow, Fez by Phil Fish, and Super Meat Boy by Tommy Refenes and Boone McMillan. Now, obviously, what these three games sort of shared in the presentation that was made by the documentary was that they were innovative, let's say, in their design, made by one person or a very small team with a limited budget, and in a production that essentially completely absorbed the personality of their authors. Now, this narrative was presented as new, and it had elements of novelties. But as I said, it was also a very simple answer regarding the story, the question of who makes video games. So we were presented with a scenario where it is no longer the big studios, these sort of big development studios that they care only about profit, but now it is also these, let's say, lonely artists who want to communicate their vision about game design to the whole world. So as all simple answers, it was hiding a good part of the picture. First of all, it was very narrow in its selection of what constitutes an independent game developer. All protagonists of this movie were white men originating from North America, from the United States and Canada specifically. The games that were being selected had a sort of shared aesthetic, a sort of retro aesthetic, aesthetic of, let's say, hand-drawn game art. And they were not completely transparent about the extent of the budget and the support of publishers, which was actually much more substantial than what they claimed or presented in the documentary. So there were many things were hidden in a way that, let's say, they didn't age well, let's say. So shortly afterwards, the narrative that was originally presented around 2010, 2012, around indie game making, revealed to be incomplete at the very least. But there were things that were definitely new at the time and which still persist. There were different technological conditions that allowed a variety of individuals to produce games that were similar, let's say, comparable to larger scale productions. Unity and Unreal Engine became freely accessible for anyone who wanted to experiment with game making. Steam allowed and facilitated online distribution. Itch.io enable a community of independent makers to sort of reach a community of, let's say, like-minded consumers. Twine and Game Maker obviously made game production much more easily accessible and open to a larger number of game makers. and platforms such as Kickstarter provided, at the very least, with the hope, let's say, of receiving funding through crowdfunding. So there were definitely things that were new in the technical conditions of production of video games, in their distribution, and in the ways in which the management of the funding of the development budget was, in the ways in that could be managed. So there were things that certainly were new and that allowed different kind of people to make games. So what remains of all of that? So in this talk, I would like to present three, let's say, main areas, three main aspects that I think we need to consider if we want to evaluate the legacy of the indie movement. So the first point is that we now live in a stage where, obviously saying that everyone is independent is an overstatement, but the conditions, the specificity, the uniqueness perhaps, or the novelty of the indie scene as it was described at that time, are now no longer that unique, let's say. They're quite commonly shared by a large number of game makers. We have new aspects that lead to an increased sense of precarity, to dynamics of self-exploitation, and to an erosion of the boundaries that separate what can be considered an independent from a AAA production. But we also, at the same time, have the emergence of communities that sort of embrace the notion of independence through different narratives, and that persist, that still make good part of game making culture nowadays. So let's start with the first point. So what do I mean with the idea that everyone is independent? There is a great text by Brendan Keogh published in 2023, The Video Game Industry Does Not Exist, where Brendan looks at the case of the Australian game industry, where what was at the time, a quite solid game industry ceased to exist essentially at some point, and left a scenario where many had the skills to work in the game industry, or were graduating in game design programs, but without having quite a clear, let's say, destination in the job market that will lead them to a game industry. And this created a sort of very large culture of game making communities that shared an interest and passion for making games, and that slowly started considering commercial game production no longer as the trajectory or the destination, let's say, of their activities. So game making became, in many cases, something that was embraced by freelancers, micro studios, contractors, temporary collaborators, amateurs, hobbyists, artists who like to sort of experiment with game design and use video games to communicate with each other, but not necessarily trying to establish an independent game production community. So it created a sort of context where, even though there is a substantial amount of video games being produced and released, we cannot really say that there is a game industry per se. Therefore, there is no industry to be independent of or from. And a similar scenario, really, it's also present, I think, in other contexts. Let's say in the United Kingdom, for instance, where we still have substantial, game industry, even though it is not as significant as it was in the 1990s, for instance. But there are still AAA companies and large companies. But if you look at the numbers reported, for instance, by the trade association TIGA, 2025, actually a few months ago, they noticed that 78% of UK studios now employ 4 or fewer staff. And they make a point, they make a case about the difficulties that actually the overwhelming majority of studios, which qualify as small and medium enterprises, are currently facing. They don't have, let's say, the security, the economic backup that would allow them to endure and to take risks, essentially. Essentially, the great majority of those who qualify as members of the game industry in the UK work on a project by project basis. So they can't really plan things too much ahead. They need to make sure that every single project breaks even in order to continue in their activity. So the scenario that we are currently looking at, and obviously my perspective here is very partial, and it is very much focused on the global north, and this applies to everything I'm going to say today. But in this scenario, the characteristics that define the idea of being independent, being working with a small budget, working on your own creative project, and being independent of publishers or large budgets, well, it is becoming quite a shared condition by the majority of people who work in this sector. And there is also something else. I mean, the independent game movement of the early 2010 became also known and popular because of they were using a specific aesthetic of personal, artisanal game art, a retro aesthetic, an aesthetic of authenticity, as Jasper Juhl argues in his book. But as any aesthetic, obviously, it can be reproduced, it can be marketed, it can be absorbed by companies of any size and budget. So obviously, if independence is an aesthetic, then that element can be easily absorbed and appropriated by the industry as a whole, or by other productions that are not necessarily defining themselves or identifying with the idea of independence. And there is also something else. I think in the technological conditions of production of video games have not radically changed, but we have seen an increasing interest and increasing investment in techniques of automation, particularly from, I would say, the early, like mid 2010, so 2013, 2015. Procedural content generation, for instance, is obviously it is not new. It is a very old technique in its concept, but in the around 2010, titles such as Minecraft, and then most notably No Man's Sky by Hello Games, they promoted this idea that procedural content generation can be used to generate large volumes of content, of objects, of items, enemies, and environments, essentially populate digital environments with relative ease. Now, these interest, this investment in this technology has allowed small teams to produce games of considerable scale, which can be compared to AAA productions. First of all, in a sort of creative sense, so small teams can technically, theoretically at least, produce titles of a size that have a certain amount of content that can be seen as challenging, in a sense, a AAA production, which has, of course, its own, creative ambitions and elements, let's say, of creative satisfaction, perhaps by the teams. But it can also allow them to price their product at a price level which is similar or much closer to a large production. This has contributed to, even though it has obviously presented, and it still is, an opportunity for small teams. And it has created, of course, very interesting, creative products, but it has also contributed to erode the boundaries that separate what can be considered an independent production from a large-scale production. Think, for instance, of the case of Hello Games, which is a British company which in 2013 became famous worldwide by promoting this the game No Man's Sky, which probably you might remember at the time that they presented this game as a game where you can explore billions and billions of planets in this sort of virtual galaxy, and all the planets were procedurally generated. So the team in itself was quite small. I think they claimed to be around 4 people, at least initially, and the game was promising billion of hours of gameplay. So a small team could generate, a large-scale production with, at least in theory, relative ease. You compare this now with Light on a Fire, which is the most recent title that Hello Games announced. Again, a title that promises a virtual environment of the size of planet Earth. That's what they're claiming. And again, this is produced through procedural content generation. It's difficult here really to start, drawing the boundary between what is, let's say, a smaller scale production by an independent company, something, of much larger magnitude. And I think it is reflected, for instance, in the popularity of the roguelike genre. Many independent teams work with roguelike titles because they facilitate, they're essentially based on the production of or reassemblage, let's say, of content of different kinds. Procedural content generation facilitates the generation of roguelike games. And for an indie studio, or let's say a small studio, if you don't want no longer to use this idea of indie or independent, for a small studio, roguelike is a game that can be scaled quite easily. And the scalability allows to place the game and the product on a different price tag, and it also allows it to reach certain audiences that might perhaps not be reached by a smaller scale production. So I'm thinking, of course, of Hades, for instance, by Supergiant Games, Spelunky, Caves of Kudor, Vampire Survivors, which is made by an Italian developer. So all these titles obviously speak of the opportunities that are now offered by the current technological landscape for the production of video games, but they also tell us that it's very difficult, let's say, to draw the boundaries, right, between an independent production and a AAA production. So this leads into the second point that I wanted to make. So we have now a new wave of precarity. If the first wave of independence carried a sort of utopian charge, the promise that anyone could make games, that creativity could be decoupled from budget, from capital, then what I'm calling here a second wave of independence is characterized by the dissipation of that charge. And not because the promise was entirely false, but because the conditions that it generated have proven far more ambivalent than what it was originally suggested. And here I like to draw on the work of Ergin Bulut, who highlights in his research how game production has always been characterized by a sort of narrative of passion labor, right? This has been documented by many researchers who have been working around game production. Casey O'Donnell, for instance, has been writing extensively about how the uses and misuses, let's say, of passion labor in attracting young creatives into the game industry, and essentially enabling forms of exploitation of game workers. But what happened with independent development is that we are now seeing a sort of normalization. The idea that you must be in game production because it is a sort of passion work, and that you're making games because you are expressing yourself, you are generating a sort of creative work, that has exacerbated. So we now see an enormous amount of workers, from young graduates, amateurs, artists, hobbyists, who are available to work on games, sometimes also with very minimal compensation. So independent game development has also increased and sort of exacerbated these conditions of precarity, not necessarily in legal terms, but as a sort of narrative, as in reframing and reshaping the narrative of passion labor. And obviously, if you go back to Indie Game, the movie, that documentary that came out in 2012, those risks were already very much visible. You might remember, if you have seen that documentary, there is a scene where Phil Fish, that you see here in this screenshot, is talking about his own game, Fez, who has been keeping him busy for, I don't know, many years, maybe 5 or 6 or 7. And he appears to be quite obsessed, to say the least, about the production of the game Fez. At some point, he claims on camera that he would be ready and willing to commit suicide if the game doesn't reach its final stages. So obviously, again, as I said, this is not a documentary that aged well. I think now, very later on, I mean, a few years later, it would have been quite disturbing to see someone saying something like that. And the documentary in itself still presents this character as somehow someone who is deeply passionate about their work. Now, this sort of narrative has, for some time, it has permeated into game production, and it has perhaps also normalized as a part of this, even though, and I'm going to discuss this later, we now also see signs of communities and practices as they try to challenge this vision. So the text I want to refer here to is the work of Angela McRobbie, which really helps us, I think, understand what's happening in relation to these narratives of passion labor and the precarity that is associated to game labor. Angela McRobbie has been working for a very long time on creative workers, not on game workers, but predominantly on creatives working in the fashion industry from the early 90s. And the way she presents the transformations in the fashion industry, I think, very closely resonate with what we see now happening in the game context. McRobbie is very clear in acknowledging how the emergence of independent labor in the fashion industry created a narrative of self-blame, first of all. So when every single individual worker becomes responsible for the output of their own work, for being creative, for being innovative, then there are really no limits to the amount of time that they can spend on their own project. They are sort of forced to love what they're doing all the time. And if their work does not reach the intended output, then they have no one to blame but themselves. As McRobbie argues, self-blame serves the interest of new capitalism well, ensuring the absence of social critique. So once responsibility is individualized, social critique is erased. McRobbie also notices how the emergence of independent fashion very rapidly became absorbed by the market. So we have seen larger companies that very rapidly absorbed and translated whatever was created by creatives into their production by readapting it, stealing essentially the work of independents. And obviously independents are left with very little barriers and protection in not seeing their work being stolen. And many authors in game studies have acknowledged how communities of independents, particularly those who are less visible, they very often do the work of experimenting and creating innovative forms of game design, only to see them later in AAA productions. And ultimately, McRobbie argues the rise of independence leads to the erasure of creativity. So the amounts of risks that an independent must take essentially makes it very difficult for them to be innovative, to spend time on things that are not, that will not lead to a guaranteed success. So ironically, as she says, we see the decline of the indies as independent authors, independent creators, and we see a rise of creative subcontractors. I think in game production, we are now very much into this sort of second wave. It is very difficult for a small studio to just be independent in a creative sense if what they are aiming to is to reach a global audience. They must sort of follow certain trajectories and patterns of the market. They must be very good at individuating and situating those. They cannot take many years of work as a risk. The risks of failing are too high, and at the same time, you also see many productions that sort of take these more innovative ideas from the independents. So in this sense, I think we are in a sort of second wave or an after independence condition, and the conditions of precarity of game labor have de facto, which were, obviously, which the indie scene kind of created the conditions for these new forms of game labor, but ironically, in a sense, this has also marked the erasure of those conditions for being creatively independent. So what remains of this indie scene? I think there is also something else, let's say, that remains, and it's the communities and networks really that support game making. And many of these communities and networks have actually started and were established at the time when the narratives of our independent game making came about, and are now persisting. They're still there. So one point that is important, I think, to highlight here is that the ways in which the indie game making became popular and became famous, as I already said at the beginning, it was very exclusive, let's say. It was creating a picture where only a very few from a very specific geographical location, from very specific race and gender, were allowed to participate in this new sort of empowering narrative of indie game making. In the work of Stephanie Bullock and Patrick Lemieux, which is, metagaming is a very complex and rich text, but they do also have an interesting point about how the indie scene came to be defined through a specific focus on the global north, right? So solidifying, in a sense, and reinforcing a narrow definition of game making practices. And this was already noticed actually in 2014 when Bennett Foddy gave a talk of the State of the Union talk at Indicate East. In 2014, there were already some claiming that the indie scene was already dead, it was already over. And Bennett Foddy, who is a game maker, artist, academic, argued that the only way in which we can think of the indie scene being already over is if we really situate it within a very narrow historical and geographical contextualization. So if we look at it in the ways in which Indie Game the movie presented the indie scene, then yes, it might be already over after a couple of years. But if we start looking at the idea of making games independently, where independence can be intended from independence from a publisher, independence from a large budget, independence from reaching, producing, a commercial success, then independent game making has always existed in different parts of the world, and it's very difficult to say that it can ever come to an end. There is, for instance, a text which I think it's quite brilliant, really, showing how this is true, by Jaroslav Welch, Gaming the Iron Curtain, where Welch looks at the practices of hobbyist and pirate game making in the 1980s in Czechoslovakia, what was at the time Czechoslovakia, and the conditions for generating and making games in Eastern Europe, with the specific kind of technologies that were available at the time, the local communities that were working in physical and proximity in making and sharing games, and obviously. By all means, we can say that these are independent productions in many ways, but they are completely alien, let's say, from the historical narrative that has been created in the early 2010 when the indie scene became popular. The work of Bo Ruberg is also perfect, absolutely great in sort of situating and opening, let's say, this perspective on what might constitute an independent game. In Ruberg Works, she documents how communities of queer and trans game developers have been working on their own video games, creating their own platforms, their own aesthetic, their own politics of game making, how they've been creating communities that share game making practices and also play each other's games. And what's interesting about this word, let's say, that Bo Ruberg analyzes and identifies is that these are not game makers that try to position themselves as independent from a mainstream industry, or they try to oppose it, they try to challenge it, or they try to sort of create something that speaks of video games. It is actually operating a sort of parallel register. Let's say that they are sort of creating their own history of the medium, their own ways of making games that doesn't necessarily look for recognition or acceptance by a supposedly pre-existing industry. The work of Anna Anthropy is also similarly making a case for the large variety of game makers that have always existed. I think that the work of Anna Anthropy was already in 2012 observing how video game creation becomes a form of expression that many share, even if they're not necessarily identifying as gamers, even if they're not trying to write the history of the medium of video games as the protagonist of Indie Game, the movie, were trying to. But games are simply used by people who have something to say, let's say, about video games. Anthropy makes, I think, this interesting analogy with being a zine author, which I think is particularly useful. So when working on a fanzine, for instance, it doesn't mean necessarily that you are an independent publisher or an independent journalist. You're using what is probably the most appropriate medium, what you have available or within reach, printed paper, for instance, to reach a community, sometimes a local community of readers. And we can think of game making in a similar way. And game making can also embrace this a zine approach. So it is made by people who are using games not because they want to become game maker or game developers or independent or non-independent, but because it is for them a sort of shared language that they can use to communicate their personal story and their personal biography, for instance. What also remains, of course, is the communities that surround festivals and initiatives such as Indicate, which of course Celia has contributed to found and to establish. So Indicate has been a festival and a community, really a network of people who work with independent game making, which exists before this sort of indie scene came about and is still existing. Amaze in Berlin is another context that gathers a large number of game makers, so people just like to experiment with games and make things that are ludic, but they're not, and using the video games as a mean of expression, but again, not necessarily by trying to be independent game makers or independent developers. And then last but not least, I think what remains in a sense, and perhaps in a sort of challenge really to what I've discussed earlier, is the emergence of narratives of collective organization. If independent game making has, by definition, in a sense, opened the idea of working individually at video games and caring for your own projects, for your own persona, for your own profile as a member of the game industry. We have also seen, I will argue, as a response to that, the emergence of narratives of collective organizing. Game Workers Unite, I think, is the most evident example. So around 2018, there was this movement for the organization of labor unions and trade unions in the game industry, which has generated a number of local initiatives. The first one was here in the United Kingdom with Game Workers Unite UK, which then translated into IWGB Game Workers. And I really look at this as a response, perhaps, to the implications that independent game making has brought into the daily lives of those who work with video games. The exacerbation of conditions of precarity, for instance, have generated the need to organize collectively, to form shared communities where the problems and issues faced by game workers are shared, discussed, and possibly resolved. All right, so to conclude, so if we return, let's say, to the question that I started with, so I think that the independent game making really brought to the fore this question: who makes video games, right? So, if in the game the movie presented this very simple narrative, it's no longer large studios, now it's these lonely individual authors. But obviously, the answer there is a bit too simple and too reductive and too exclusionary and dismissive of issues and barriers of inclusivity in relation to race, gender, class, and geographical specificity. So if we want to answer this question, let's say, avoiding reductive answers, we must revisit, I think, the history and geography of game making. So looking at what has been happening in a variety of contexts, as Bennett Foddy, for instance, argues, or Jaroslav Svelch, the history of game making shows us that in many other parts of the world, independent, if you want to call it that way, game making has always existed, has always been present. And we should also turn our attention to those less visible communities and practices. So, as Bo Ruberg, for instance, argues, that the communities of queer and trans game makers who have for very long organized and created highly innovative and original video games without necessarily trying to be recognized as independent game makers. So I think ultimately the legacy of independent video games, now in an age where the distinctions and the boundaries between independence and non-independence are very difficult to draw and probably no longer relevant, the heritage of all this essentially is this an attention, an attentiveness towards the question of who makes video games. And I think it's a question that many in game culture are now asking themselves. They're a bit more attentive to how games are being made. And I think, for instance, Game Workers Unite has made a very good job in raising awareness on the dynamics of exploitation that many game workers have to endure. But it has also created attentiveness from the academic side. I think myself and Celia, many others, we are now investigating game production cultures, also I think as a result of the question that has been brought about by independent game development around 15 years ago. So yeah, that's, I think it's my intervention, my notes on the legacy of the independent movement. Thank you very much.
I would love to start a conversation with you about this. I don't know how to get my video back on the screen. Not really sure. What happens if you close your, there we go.
Yeah.
Oh, this is great. Thank you so much, Paolo. I love this talk so much. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some nuances that might be worth kind of thinking through as part of this discussion. So in the book that I wrote about Indiecade, the history of Indiecade, one of the things I talk about very early on in the book is this idea of policing terminology. And when we started Indiecade, we went back and forth for some time about the terms game and the terms indie and whether or not we wanted to use them. Because at the time that we started Indiecade, the people who were owning the term indie, including the people who made the movie and people at the Game Developers Conference who ran the IGF, had a very narrow definition of both indie and game. And a couple of examples of things that we brought into the mix and sort of revisited, and you talk about this a little bit in your talk. One was there was this burgeoning art game movement that started in the early 2000s. Australia was one of the birthplaces of this, but it was also coming out of California, out of Cal Arts, out of other art schools. NYU, Bennett Foddy was a part of that, right? There was this art games movement, which was completely ignored by the indie game community. And when people making those games would submit games to indie festivals, they would just get summarily rejected, often because they were told that they weren't making games. So people were policing both of these terms, game and indie, in a very specific way. And one of the best examples of how IndieCade kind of pushed back at this was precisely those queer games you talked about. When Anthropy and other, particularly trans developers, started showing up around 20, I'm going to say 14, 15, with these Twine games, right? There was this big, Sam and I saw the database, like, where are all these Twine games coming from? At that moment, the indie game community that defined the film did not consider Twine games to be games because they had not been programmed by the developers. That was the rationale they had. Well, this is an engine. It's not really a game. It's not really coded by the creators, and therefore it's not legitimately either a game or indie. And our response to that was, no, this is even more indie than the stuff that's being defined by films like, Indie Games, the movie. And so we have always been, we made a decision to keep pushing back against those limited definitions all the way up to now, where we're showing VR, we're showing theater work, we're showing tabletop games. And so I wanted to talk about this idea of like policing terminology, this what you described was this kind of cult of personality around the white guy, tortured artist, indie developer, and how what a narrow slice of the reality of what was going on at the time and continues to go on, not only the global north, but even the US, right? There's a bunch of stuff going on in Europe because Europe has a much different arts ecosystem with arts funding. Even the UK has arts funding in a way the US does not. Australia continues to be a leader. It's interesting that you mentioned Brandon Keogh because he's one of the people studying that. So I feel like I really like that you focused on this kind of idea of this myth of the indie developer and how this needs to be really interrogated and expanded quite a bit. And even more so now, because now we're in this VR moment, right, where there's new festivals popping up that do VR that don't call themselves games, but we continue to embrace that work under the umbrella of indie games because, again, people are doing it outside of mainstream industry structures and constraints. So sorry for the diatribe, but I just thought I would start that conversation with you and think a little bit about, how are these terms policed? Who gets to decide what indie and what game are?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And I remember vividly that time when, early like 2010, but even earlier, when many festivals, started popping up. I remember there was one in Scandinavia where there was happening across the Øresund bridge between Denmark and Sweden, which I attended as part of my field work. Can't remember the exact name, but there were some in the UK, even in Italy. There have been some events and festivals around independent game making. But in that historical period, when this idea of being independent came about in the popular discourse, it really came about as a sort of opposition to, right? So in being independent means at that time it meant in that word, it meant being different from whatever the game industry is doing. So there was a sort of negative, right, self-definition, which was always pragmatic, very flexible, very self-contradictory in many ways.
But also the people that propagated that idea were from the mainstream game industry.
Sure.
They were literally people who were refugees from that industry, as opposed to people like the Anthropy zine folks who were in their own, like you said, parallel lane. They weren't in any kind of direct relationship at all with the video game industry. Neither were the artists that came out of CalArts, for instance, or NYU. So I really like you thinking about that. Like, it's almost like when people talk about post-colonialism, people I've spoken to from colonialized countries talk about, well, we don't want to be defined by colonialism, right? So I think it's the same idea that like indie doesn't have to be the opposite of mainstream. It is just it can be a separate thing entirely.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be independent. I mean, that's the thing with, for instance, Boruberg, I think, argues very well that, for many who make games that we might, define as independent in terms of like being very creative, low budget, etc. For many of them who have been making this kind of games even way before the 2010, they never really thought of themselves as being independent of an industry. In the same ways that you can be an artist and not necessarily defining yourself as an independent artist, or writing a poetry, but you're not necessarily an independent poet, right? So you're simply using a sort of tool, a mean of expression. Sometimes it is available to you, and using it for whatever you want to do. Now, that practice might also have a commercial ambition, or it might not. But it's not necessarily defined in relation or in opposition to a pre-established industry. Now, what in time I came to start thinking about, perhaps a bit suspiciously, is that the ways in which independent game making became known, which is through, let's say, the Independent Game Festival, or things that were sort of, we have, let's say, Independent Game Festival, I think, is a perfect example. We have, the Game Developers Conference, which is for, the real industry, and then we have the independent, which is, the others. So that kind of narrative really,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the thing about the IGF at the Game Developers Conferences, it was never independent. It's always been juried by people from the mainstream game industry. They had a very strong policing, and most of the people that submit to it want their games to become commercial. So even though they're saying they're indie, their goal is to get a publishing deal. That was always the sort of ecosystem of that. As opposed to museums, for instance, where you go to, there's a number of galleries and museums that show art games, or something like Baby Castles in New York, that are in no way interested in mainstream success, right? That's not even part of their agenda. They live in a whole different ecosystem.
That is exactly what I'm trying to say. Yes, but what then enabled at the same time was that it made popular a certain idea that you can also make games with no budget. You can also make games that reach an international, get an international success just by using your own creative genius, imagination, and then enabled much higher levels of precarity in the game industry. So it was a way through which dynamics of precarious labor that were already existent in other creative sectors entered the game industry and game production cultures. Ultimately, I think that's, what that scene really enabled was the idea that you have no excuses, let's say, not to, you should, if you want to make games, you should be ready to exploit yourself and to reach your goals. And if you don't, you're the only person to blame.
But also the goal is to become commercially successful, right? So there are other models that I think are really interesting. For instance, the game Never Alone is a great example of a game that is sort of independent, but sort of not, in almost a similar way that independent films are produced in the film industry. Like, the film industry has a weird model because they have these independent films that are funded by major studios who have a division that specializes in essentially art films, right? And so in a way, Eline is one of those companies that gives a decent budget to people creating alternative, non-commercial games. But we don't have a lot of, at least in the US, we don't have a lot of those kinds of companies that have a similar relationship that something like, oh gosh, I'm forgetting all the names now. There's all these independent studios that are really like a division of a big studio in the film industry. So Arte is a great example of one where they do both games and films, right? But they're not really indie. they fund and support people that are working outside of the mainstream industry. But I feel like this is the thing that I'm wondering about. Like, is there an alternative ecosystem, or does one exist elsewhere? We see that a little bit of this in China, where some of the Chinese studios have an indie arm like this that funds separate independent studios. Is there another model that we can use beside art grants?
Oh, well, I don't know. But again, yeah, that's difficult to say. I mean, many models have been, tried and experimented, for a long time. There were also incubators or like publishers that were specifically targeting independent productions or new studios. Or in Europe, for instance, there is funding from the European Union, although it is very limited, but it does provide funding to small scale productions. So there are
And
things.
Arte is a French company, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So
But they fund
Arte
US.
is
Or is it
a
French,
Oh,
German?
French-German
Yeah.
TV channel.
Mm-hmm.
oh, okay.
And it is funded, I think, by public funds from both countries.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, in France, in general, TV channels do buy programs, and sometimes they invest funds in order to produce them from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. I think
So
Danish
that's a
television has
different
done that.
model.
I think Danish television has done that as well. But that's interesting that you bring that up, Nellie, because at least in Denmark, it's a state-run television station that has funded independent documentary games, right?
Yeah, and in France also the CNC, the National Center uh, of Cinema, they have a whole category for games now, or interactive art games, and
Yeah,
they do fund them. And
BBC has funded games on and off for years. Obviously, BAFTA has been including games for many years as well in their remit. I don't see any
but
questions.
the question
Anybody
I
here?
wanted to
Oh
ask
yeah,
quickly maybe
yeah.
was because I, originally come more from film and indie films. Um, and the industry is much more structured, at least in the US, and they have unions, and there are, when you hire an actor, is either union or non-union, and there are different rates, etc., and the union provide for like healthcare, retirement, all of those things, what a union is supposed to do. Yeah, I'm wondering why it didn't happen with the game industry, because it's kind of the same thing. There are big movies, big studio, lots of funding, and then small indie, self-funded, or with artist grants or whatever they try to. Um,
I mean,
yeah.
in my book, in my book about Indiecade, one of the things I talk about up front is that the mainstream game industry was at the time that we started Indiecade and remains very similar to the film industry of the 1930s. The pre-union industry, the pre-free agency industry. My grandfather worked for MGM for his entire adult life, and he went through the period when there was a strike and when the unions began. But when he started out, everybody was owned by a studio. Only actors and directors ever got credit for anything. Sometimes screenwriters, many of whom were women, but sometimes they didn't. And everything was very corporate and centralized. And then there was a big union movement, I guess, kind of in the 1930s when unions were coming up throughout the United States and often repressed. But the game industry has been doing everything in its power since I started in the 80s to prevent itself from going through what the film industry went through. And so I think what we're seeing here is this sort of ossified version of the studio system of the 30s that has just persisted without any kind of intervention. But what's happening now that's so fascinating to me is that system is failing. And part of the reason it's failing is because it doesn't have a sustainable business model. As games get more and more expensive to make and the prices remain completely level, there's not really any way to innovate. and there's not really any way to make any money anymore. And so that's why they'll dip into the indie ecosystem, because they know, oh, this is a cheaper game to fund. So this is where, like, that game company, right, had a successful model. Was their games cost, 1/100th of what it costs to make a mainstream blockbuster game. And so, but they made back, I mean, Journey was the most popular PSN game for a couple of years, like the best-selling PSN game of all time at one point, even though it cost a fraction of what many other of the commercial games that PlayStation had. So I think that they're not going to be there. There's something's going to have to give, because, with all the layoffs and everything, they're not going to be able to keep making games bigger and bigger and selling them for the same amount of money ad infinitum, I don't think.
Let's see if anyone wants to add a question from the chat. I don't see any questions. Anyone wants
It's great to hear your perspective on this, Nathalie, though. I love hearing that. Also, I think VR is an interesting counterpoint in a way, because it's in the early nascent, right? It's not really an industry yet. And so...
Yeah, but it's been taken over by corporate very, very fast. We were hoping to have like 10 years of like indie development and stuff, but within 2-3 years they just took over. So yeah.
But it feels like now, with all the Meta layoffs, that we're in a different cycle. Like, I'm seeing more and more, people are kind of giving up on Meta/Facebook, and because you can develop with Unity, we're sort of back into a mode of people just doing their own thing. VR chat has become kind of the de facto indie space for people who want to make stuff outside of the mainstream, because it's so easy to develop for, and you can just publish your own stuff whenever.
Yeah. There is a question.
Yeah.
Is crowdfunding still as big as an option for indie games? It was huge in the mid-late 2010, but it's less nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, my impression from what I hear from game developers and from people who do research in this is that crowdfunding was very popular around that time. It is slowly started becoming less popular, and I also don't really hear much about crowdfunding nowadays. There is research on how game developers started using Kickstarter and other crowdfunding platforms, and very often what has been reported is that it created an excessive burden on the developers. So what appears on surface level as something where you just put your idea there and attract funding, it actually requires constant attention and lots of
the labor involved in placating your funders. Yeah. I mean, I've gone through that with my own projects. Yeah, it just adds more labor to an already overworked right situation.
Yeah, exactly. So you end up having this sort of double work, and for many, generated like many disastrous projects. I mean, I think they were not able to cope.
I think the grant ecosystem is an interesting one, which right now in the U.S. is kind of in a weird, I would say, sort of surrealistic limbo going on because of the current administration. But I was actually involved in helping the NEA rewrite their guidelines to include games back around 2014 or 15, I think. Maybe a little earlier than that, because I think I was still at Georgia Tech. So, but in the U.S., the grant ecosystem is very, very lackluster. I think in other places, I'm part of this LARPocracy project out of Denmark, which is EU funded, and it's a whole project with multiple countries involved around using live action role playing to promote democracy. So that's a thing that is impossible in the United States. Like, that would never happen here.
We should probably wrap up. It's 10:10.
I think that was the only question we had. Okay, thanks for the question, Will. And thank you so much for joining us, Paolo. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And it was great seeing you again. And thank you for joining us. And everybody, the video will be available online at some point. I'm not sure how, but I think Abby's taking care of that, so we'll get some archives somewhere for people to look at. Thanks
on
very
the
much.
YouTube channel, on the Games at
Oh,
Northeastern
YouTube.
channel.
Oh, yeah. Perfect. This will be on the Games. All right, fantastic.
All right.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.